a respected judge faced public humiliation in his own courtroom, challenging everyone's belief that justice can truly defend itself when power is abused. Jonathan Hale, the CEO whose arrogance and disregard for the law shocked an entire city, seemed unstoppable as he pushed limits and ignored consequences. Yet behind Harold McKinley's calm presence, a decisive turn set in motion events that no one anticipated, one that put Lexfield Industries and its leader at real risk. Watch how justice not only fights back but delivers a resolution that grips to the very end. The Atlanta courthouse buzzed with anticipation from the early morning hours. A line of reporters formed outside, eager to capture every detail of a trial that had already become the city's most talked-about event of the year. Inside, the gallery was filled to capacity community leaders, business insiders, students, and ordinary citizens all pressed together, their eyes drawn toward the podium where history was quietly unfolding. Judge Harold McKinley presided over the scene with the kind of unassuming authority that commands respect. His polished shoes tapped softly against the dais as he arranged his notes, greeting each arrival with a composed nod. Those who had followed his career knew the symbolic weight he carried. Harold was the first black chief judge in the district's recent memory, a figure who represented resilience and the slow, determined advance of justice against long-standing barriers. He wore his robe not as armor, but as a sign that the law, imperfect as it might be, still had a place to shelter those who depended on it. At the defendant's table sat Jonathan Hale, the driving force behind Lexfield Industries, a man whose reputation for brilliance was only matched by his record of controversy. Tall, sharp-featured, styled impeccably in a navy suit, Jonathan radiated the self-assurance of someone accustomed to getting his way. To the uninitiated, he might have seemed like any other successful businessman defending his interests, but those who watched him closely saw the subtle tics that betrayed his discomfort. The way his fingers drummed on the table, the fleeting glances toward his lawyers, the tight line of his jaw each time his company's actions were brought into question. As the proceedings began, Harold offered his opening remarks. His voice was even, neither cold nor perfunctory, but invested with an unmistakable conviction. He reminded everyone present that the court was not just an arena for winners and losers, but a place where every person, regardless of power or privilege, stood equal before the law. It was a message aimed at the city as much as at the man sitting across from him. Jonathan struggled to maintain his composure. Long used to boardrooms and business meetings where charm and force of will could change the outcome, here his confidence seemed slightly out of place. Still, he tried to regain control through small performances, smirking at procedural delays, sharing whispered jokes with his attorneys, rolling his eyes for the benefit of the news cameras arrayed at the back of the room. His supporters in the gallery laughed quietly along with him, but others, community activists, students, the families of Lexfield workers hurt by past layoffs, watched in silent disapproval. To them, Jonathan's bravado felt less like confidence and more like a challenge to the dignity of the court itself. The tension mounted with every update of evidence and witness testimony. Lawyers for the prosecution meticulously detailed Lexfield's alleged patterns of exploitation and misconduct, drawing out the narrative of ordinary people whose lives had been overturned by decisions made in distant offices. Judge McKinley listened intently, his questions both probing and precise, demanding clarity from those who tried to cloud the truth in technicalities. Each time Harold brought the proceedings back to order, Jonathan's annoyance grew more visible. At first, the CEO limited himself to thinly disguised sarcasm, questioning the relevance of minor points or feigning boredom when his attorneys were unable to challenge the prosecution's facts. But it was clear to those with a discerning eye that beneath Jonathan's calculated exterior, tension was brewing. The realization that this courtroom, with its austere wood panels and relentless cameras, might be the one place he could not bend reality to his will. Midway through the day, the simmering conflict came to a head. After a particularly stern warning about courtroom decorum, delivered by Harold in his calm but commanding tone, Jonathan could no longer contain himself. He rose abruptly, his movements clipped, voice rising as he demanded to be heard over the judge. The room froze, every whisper silenced, every phone poised to record what would happen next. Defying every expectation of protocol and respect, Jonathan closed the distance between himself and Harold. His gesture was sudden, unplanned. There was no time for security or attorneys to intervene. The confrontation was not merely physical, it was the collision of two worlds, a man emboldened by years of unchecked authority, and a judge shaped by battles for dignity and justice. For one suspended moment, the room was caught in shock. Reporters' flashes illuminated the disbelief on every face. Security moved swiftly, but the moment had already been claimed by the cameras and the collective memory of all who witnessed it. The tension in the air shifted from suspense to outrage, confusion giving way to a sense that something meaningful and irrevocable had just happened. Even as order was restored and the interruption handled with professional efficiency, the tone of the trial had changed forever. No longer was this merely a legal drama. It was now a confrontation of values, a test of what the community truly believed about justice, power, and respect. By the close of the session, the ordinary machinery of the court paperwork, legal language, traditional rituals, felt transformed. For Judge Harold McKinley, the incident underscored everything he had fought for: fairness in the face of arrogance, law as the last defense for those without other recourse. For Jonathan, the reality of consequences appeared for the first time as a tangible presence, shadowing his every move. And for the city watching on their screens, the question lingered: what happens when those who hold the most power reveal, in a single unguarded moment, that even they may be called to account? News of the shocking incident in the Atlanta courthouse spread rapidly, picked up first by local outlets and quickly turning into a trending topic across social media. Clips of the confrontation circulated on every major network, and commentary poured in from all sides, some expressing disbelief, others outrage, many reflecting on what the moment revealed about the state of power and respect in the justice system. For Judge Harold McKinley, the aftermath brought not just public attention, but a deeply personal sense of disappointment. Though he returned to the bench with dignified composure, the echoes of that day stayed with him, reminding him of a truth he knew well: progress, even when hard-earned, can feel fragile. Growing up in neighborhoods where every victory was a struggle, Harold's ambition had always been paired with the hope of making a difference. Rising to the position of chief judge was more than a career achievement. It was a source of pride for his family, and a symbol of possibility for many who looked to him for inspiration. The days following the incident saw an outpouring of support from community members and leaders. Messages arrived in the form of handwritten notes, phone calls, and emails, expressions of gratitude, encouragement, and shared frustration. Some thanked Harold for his unwavering stand against intimidation. Others shared stories about the challenges they, too, had faced in environments where they were often underestimated. In these words, Harold found a reminder of his mission: to keep justice accessible, fair, and unbowed. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hale became the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. What had begun as a display of confidence quickly became a source of controversy. As his actions were dissected across talk shows, opinion pieces, and public gatherings, questions surfaced about Lexfield Industries' internal culture and Jonathan's broader approach to leadership. Was his defiant behavior a one-time lapse, or a reflection of deeper attitudes embedded in the company's way of doing business? Within the Lexfield boardroom, the atmosphere changed overnight. Executives and advisors scrambled to respond to the backlash, drafting statements and preparing crisis strategies. Some worried about the ripple effect on partnerships and shareholder confidence. Others questioned whether the company's aggressive brand, once seen as a strength, would now work against them as public opinion shifted. Through all these reactions, a quieter but more enduring kind of pain took root for Harold, in remembering all the struggles that led him to this point, and for Jonathan in the growing realization that power, once undermined by a single moment, could not easily be reclaimed. The city, too, looked inward, forced to reckon with what it had witnessed not just as spectacle, but as a mirror held to its own values. As days passed and statements were made, one truth became increasingly clear. The courtroom had not only been a place where evidence and arguments were weighed, but a stage where unseen tensions came to the surface. For many who had watched events unfold, It was no longer possible to ignore the lines that divided confidence from arrogance, strength from empathy, and public image from personal character. The city's fascination with the case only grew in the days that followed, and with each headline the pressure on everyone involved reached new heights. News crews gathered outside Lexfield Industries' corporate headquarters, while the courthouse remained surrounded by people seeking updates or simply wanting to stand witness to unfolding history. For Judge Harold McKinley, life became a continual balancing act between judicial duty and the sudden reality of public scrutiny. Inside the courthouse halls, Harold maintained professionalism and resolve. He arrived before sunrise, reviewing stacks of legal filings at his desk, preparing not just for the arguments of seasoned attorneys, but for the increased presence of observers and the ceaseless attention of the press. He never showed hesitation in the courtroom, but in unguarded moments, memories surfaced of the early obstacles he had overcome. Each setback from the past, each moment of doubt, had shaped the calm integrity he brought into the present storm. While Harold worked to keep the trial's focus on facts and fairness, outside forces swirled with growing intensity. The city was alive with conversations about justice and authority. On radio shows and in coffee shops, neighbors debated whether power in America was truly subject to accountability. Many spoke of Harold's calm refusal to react with anger, seeing it as proof of his commitment to principle. Others, confronting the spectacle of Jonathan's public misstep, wondered if this might finally be the moment where consequences applied equally, no matter a person's influence or background. Within Lexfield, Jonathan Hale faced mounting challenges on all fronts. The boardroom no longer provided a refuge. Executives met in tense clusters, anxiously tracking every fluctuation in the company's stock price. Investors demanded reassurances in urgent late-night meetings. For the first time in his career, Jonathan found himself on the defensive, forced to answer not only for his company's actions, but for his own behavior. He attempted to project the old confidence drafting carefully worded statements, scheduling interviews with trusted outlets, but the cameras, once his allies, now seemed unmoved by performance. Even the company's toughest loyalists struggled with doubts they had never voiced before. Behind closed doors, senior staff debated strategy. Some favored a direct apology, hoping to salvage public trust. Others pushed for defiance, confident that the storm would soon pass. Jonathan, usually decisive and quick to action, wavered in uncertainty. He remembered every step along his rise to power, the long hours, the risks, the competition, the relentless drive to prove himself superior. That drive had fed his ambition and shielded him from doubts about the cost. But now, those old certainties felt brittle, threatened by a force he could neither dismiss nor fully control. The focus of the case itself shifted dramatically. What began as a matter of business misconduct had drawn national attention, and new investigations were announced almost daily. Whistleblowers stepped forward, providing documentation of past deals, questionable accounting, and exploitative labor practices. Regulatory agencies, politicians, and activist groups seized the opportunity to demand a full accounting, not only from Lexfield, but from a culture that had long insulated its leaders from real accountability. In every hearing, Harold's questions grew sharper. He pressed attorneys on the facts, refusing to allow deflections or evasions. The narrative had changed. It was no longer just about one company's conduct, but about whether justice could, at last, extend even to the powerful. Harold guided proceedings with a calm clarity that refocused the city's attention. Each ruling was issued methodically, every motion considered with care, each rebuke measured to show the seriousness of the court's purpose. Jonathan felt the change most acutely. On his way to hearings, he noticed the lack of familiar nods from staff. Even the company's long-serving receptionist offered only polite silence. Conversations in the hallways grew quiet when he entered. He took calls from advisors urging retreat, deals to limit exposure, strategies that might have seemed prudent before, but now struck him as betrayals of the drive that had made him formidable. He watched his empire built on victories, fast decisions, risk and reward, become vulnerable in ways he could never have imagined. For Harold, the weight of responsibility increased with each development. He knew mistakes now would be magnified, every word scrutinized for evidence of bias or weakness. He revisited each case file with added diligence, determined that his rulings should stand as models of integrity, no matter the verdict. The personal hurt from the confrontation lingered, but he refused to let it dictate his actions. His motivation became not vengeance, but the hope of setting an example, one that would make others believe real justice was possible, no matter who stood accused. As the city watched, both men lived with the consequences of a single moment, one defined by impulsive defiance, the other by resolve shaped through a lifetime of endurance. Their battle, waged in legal filings, news cycles, and courtroom exchanges, was seen by many as a test for the city's conscience. Public opinion continued to shift. The old narratives about untouchable power faded with each new revelation. Pundits who once praised Jonathan's skill now questioned his ethics. Supporters who once doubted Harold now voiced newfound respect, seeing in his steadiness not just professionalism, but courage. Families gathered each night to watch trial reports, discussing the legacy these events might leave behind on their neighborhood, on their city, and for future leaders figuring out how to wield power with care. In this growing storm, Harold and Jonathan did not just represent themselves. They had become avatars for larger forces, one for the quiet persistence of fairness, the other for the dangers of unchecked ambition. Each day's proceedings carried the weight of that symbolism, shaping the outcome not just for the courtroom, but for all who watched and waited to see what would come next. The day of the final verdict began long before sunrise. Streets around the courthouse filled with onlookers, cameras set up on every available corner, and journalists delivered live commentaries as vehicles carrying both parties slowly arrived. The atmosphere was charged, not with aggression, but with a kind of silent anticipation. For days, crowds had gathered to follow the dramatic turns in the case, each person hoping to witness a resolution that would confirm their belief in the fairness of the process. Inside, the courtroom was almost reverently quiet. Supporters of Harold McKinley and former Lexfield employees, many of whom had shared stories of hardship, sat side by side with company executives and members of Jonathan Hale's once loyal circle. Even as people exchanged glances and quiet words, there was a sense of unity in the seriousness with which they awaited the ruling. No one wanted to miss a single moment. Judge McKinley entered with measured calm, his presence grounding and unhurried. Every person in the room, regardless of allegiance, seemed to sense what it meant for him to stand at the center of such a public storm and remain focused, shaped by all the history and expectation that brought him to this moment. As he began to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. His words were careful, his tone unwavering. Evidence had been examined, testimonies heard, every legal principle weighed against the values of fairness and accountability. The decision, as he read it, was clear. Lexfield Industries would lose its protections, its assets frozen pending further review, and its leadership barred from management until the resolution of ongoing investigations. Jonathan Hale, for his conduct in and out of the courtroom, would face consequences not only official but personal, a loss of credibility, years spent rebuilding rather than ruling. The verdict rippled outward. For supporters of the judge and the public watching from home, there was a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Justice had set its mark, not blindly, but thoughtfully. People outside the courthouse began to cheer, yet inside the response was quieter, marked by the recognition that something significant had shifted. There was no sudden eruption, no scenes of triumph over a vanquished enemy, simply the weight of transformation, the recognition that rules had held where so many doubted they would. Jonathan's reaction revealed the gravity of his fall from grace. He absorbed the news in silence, realizing perhaps more than anyone how different the future looked now. The expressions of his attorneys and former supporters mirrored a shared understanding. The authority they had depended on was no longer theirs to claim. Harold McKinley looked over the courtroom before stepping down from the bench. In his eyes there was neither pride nor bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of the role he'd played in steering a difficult process to its end. Outside, he greeted the assembled crowd briefly, his remarks short and dignified. He spoke not of victory over another man, but of the value of rules and the power of patience. For the city, the trial became a story retold countless times, a lesson etched not in confrontation, but in steady resolve. If justice could withstand challenge even from the most influential, there was hope for everyone seeking fairness in a world so often shaped by advantage. The courthouse doors remained open long after the day's proceedings, and as people filed out, many paused for a final look, grateful that even in the most public storms the promise of justice could be kept alive.